Che Guevara, from medical student to revolutionary icon. Hello, dear learners. Welcome back to our channel where history comes alive and inspires us to think differently about the world. Today we embark on one of the most controversial, most fascinating, and most debated journeys in modern history, the life of Ernesto Che Guevara. This is not just a story about a revolutionary. It's a story about transformation, about a young medical student who became the face of rebellion worldwide. It's about idealism, sacrifice, and the price of fighting for what you believe in. Listening to this story will help you improve your English vocabulary, pronunciation, and listening skills. But more than that, it will challenge you to think about justice, freedom, and what it means to stand up for your beliefs. So get ready for the most intense, most thought-provoking story you've ever heard. Let's begin the journey of Che Guevara, a man whose image became more famous than almost any other revolutionary in history. The boy who would change the world. Ernesto Guevara de la Serna was born on June 14, 1928, in Rosario, Argentina, a beautiful port city on the Parana River. His parents, Ernesto Guevara Lynch and Celia de la Serna, came from aristocratic Spanish and Irish backgrounds. They were unconventional people, intellectual, bohemian, and politically progressive. His mother especially was a free spirit who wore pants when women didn't, smoked in public, and read banned leftist literature. Young Ernesto, whom everyone called Ernestito, was just 3 weeks old when he first showed signs of asthma. It was a condition that would torment him for his entire life. His parents took him to the mountains, hoping the dry air would help. They moved constantly, searching for climates that would ease his breathing, but the asthma never left him. Imagine being a child who couldn't breathe. Nights spent gasping for air, unable to run and play like other children. But Ernesto refused to let his illness define him. His mother later said he had such determination. When he couldn't breathe, he would will himself to breathe. He turned weakness into strength. The Guevara home was filled with books, thousands of them. His parents' library contained works by Marx, Engels, Freud, and Pablo Neruda. Young Ernesto devoured them all. By age 12, he was reading French poetry in the original language. By 14, he had consumed his father's entire collection of political philosophy. But Ernesto wasn't just an intellectual. He was fiercely competitive. Despite his asthma, he played rugby, one of the most physically demanding sports. His teammates were amazed. During attacks, he would simply stop, use his inhaler, and continue playing. He swam, he climbed mountains, he pushed his body beyond what doctors said was possible. His childhood friend Alberto Granado remembered. Ernesto didn't know the meaning of the word quit. When his lungs betrayed him, his will carried him forward. The Guevara family wasn't wealthy, despite their aristocratic background. Ernesto's father made poor business decisions, and they moved frequently, sometimes struggling to pay rent. This gave Ernesto something invaluable. He saw both privilege and poverty. He understood what it meant to fall from comfort. During these formative years, something else shaped him. He witnessed inequality everywhere. Argentina in the 1930s and 1940s was a country of extreme contrasts. Wealthy landowners lived in mansions while workers starved. Ernesto saw children begging in the streets. He saw families evicted from their homes. These images burned into his consciousness. When Ernesto was 13, the Spanish Civil War ended with Franco's fascist victory. His parents had supported the Republicans, and refugees began arriving in Argentina. The Guevara family welcomed them into their home. Young Ernesto listened to their stories of war, of fighting for ideals, of losing everything for a cause. These conversations planted seeds that would later bloom into revolution. When Ernesto was 17, he decided to become a doctor. not because he wanted wealth or prestige, but because he wanted to help people who suffered as he had suffered. He once wrote in his diary, "I want to understand what makes people suffer. I want to cure not just bodies, but the conditions that create sickness." He enrolled at the University of Buenos Aires in 1947 to study medicine. He was a brilliant but unconventional student. He memorized entire textbooks, often reading them just once. But he also questioned everything. He challenged his professors, arguing that medicine couldn't be separated from social conditions. During his university years, Ernesto worked in a hospital treating the poor. He saw patients who couldn't afford medicine. He saw diseases that came from malnutrition and unsanitary conditions. He began to understand that poverty itself was a disease, and that medicine alone couldn't cure it. But young Ernesto was also restless. He had inherited his parents' wanderlust. In 1950, during a university break, he bought a small engine for a bicycle and traveled 4,500 kilometers across northern Argentina alone. He wanted to see his country, to understand the lives of ordinary people beyond the books he read. This journey awakened something in him. He met farmers who worked land they didn't own. He met indigenous people who had been pushed to the margins of society. He saw the descendants of Spanish conquistadors still living as feudal lords. Each encounter was a lesson in injustice. His father later said, "After that trip, Ernesto came back different. There was a fire in his eyes that hadn't been there before." But the real transformation was still to come. In December 1951, Ernesto and his friend Alberto Granado embarked on a journey that would change his life forever. They would travel across South America on a motorcycle, a journey that would turn a comfortable medical student into a revolutionary. The motorcycle journey that changed everything. On January 4, 1952, Ernesto and Alberto left Buenos Aires on a 1939 500cc motorcycle they nicknamed La Poderosa, the Mighty One. Ernesto was 23 years old, just months away from completing his medical degree. The plan was simple: travel through Argentina, Chile, Peru, Colombia, and Venezuela, have adventures, see the world, and return home. But this journey became something far more profound. They rode through the windswept plains of Patagonia, where sheep outnumbered people 1,000 to 1. They crossed the Andes Mountains, where the motorcycle's engine struggled in the thin air, and Ernesto's lungs struggled even more. They visited the ancient Incan ruins of Machu Picchu, where Ernesto stood in awe of a civilization destroyed by European conquest. But it wasn't the landscapes that transformed him, it was the people. In Chile, they visited the Chuquicamata copper mine, one of the largest in the world. Ernesto watched miners emerge from underground, their faces black with dust, their bodies bent from years of labor. These men extracted wealth from the earth, yet they lived in poverty. The mine was owned by an American company, the profits went north, the lung disease stayed in Chile. Ernesto wrote in his diary, "It's a huge cemetery. The smell of copper sulfate hangs in the air. The workers are like shadows, not quite alive, not quite dead." One night, they met a communist couple who had been persecuted for their beliefs. They had been forced to travel in freezing weather, searching for work, shunned by society. Ernesto and Alberto had only one blanket, but they gave it to the couple and slept in the cold themselves. That night, shivering under the stars, Ernesto understood something. Ideology had consequences in the real world. People suffered not just from disease or bad luck, but from systems designed to keep them powerless. As they traveled north through Peru, they volunteered at a leper colony in the Amazon called San Pablo. This experience shook Ernesto to his core. The patients were outcasts, abandoned by society, treated as less than human, but Ernesto refused to wear gloves when examining them, as was customary. He shook their hands, he ate with them, he treated them as people, not as diseases. On his 24th birthday, the lepers threw him a party. Moved by their gesture, Ernesto made a decision. Despite his asthma, despite not having swum in months, he dove into the Amazon River and swam across to the other side where the lepers lived, refusing to take the boat. It was a symbolic act, crossing the river that separated the healthy from the sick, the privileged from the forgotten. Alberto later recalled, "That swim across the river, that was when Ernesto left his old life behind. When he emerged on the other side, he was a different man." Throughout the journey, the motorcycle broke down repeatedly. Eventually, in Chile, La Pudorosa died completely. From that point on, Ernesto and Alberto hitchhiked, walked, and worked odd jobs to continue. This forced intimacy with ordinary life, riding in the backs of trucks with peasants, sleeping in police stations, going hungry, stripped away any remaining romantic notions Ernesto had about poverty. In Peru, he saw indigenous people treated as servants in their own land. In Colombia, he witnessed La Violencia, the brutal civil conflict between conservatives and liberals that would claim hundreds of thousands of lives. In Venezuela, he saw American oil companies extracting resources while locals remained impoverished. A pattern emerged everywhere he traveled. Foreign companies owned the natural resources, local elites collaborated with them, and the masses suffered. The wealth of Latin America was being exported while its people starved. Ernesto wrote, "I now know, by virtue of these travels, that the people of Latin America have far more in common with each other than the artificial boundaries suggest. We share the same exploitation, the same oppression, the same need for liberation." The journey lasted 8 months. They covered nearly 8,000 kilometers. When Ernesto returned to Argentina in July 1952, he was not the same person who had left. He finished his medical degree in just 6 months, rushing through his final exams with intense focus. But he already knew he would never practice conventional medicine. On his medical degree certificate, the name read Ernesto Guevara de la Serna, MD. But the man who received it was already thinking beyond individual patients. He was thinking about curing societies. His friend Ricardo Rojo remembered, "Before the trip, Ernesto talked about medicine and rugby. After the trip, he talked only about revolution." In his diary, Ernesto wrote words that would define the rest of his life. "I came to understand that I had to become part of the solution. It wasn't enough to study the problem. The world isn't changed by doctors treating symptoms. It's changed by revolutionaries destroying the disease at its root." But Ernesto didn't know how to become that revolutionary. He didn't yet have a clan. So, in July 1953, he set off on a second journey, this time with his friend Carlos Calica Ferrer. They traveled through Bolivia, Peru, Ecuador, Panama, Costa Rica, and Guatemala. It was in Guatemala where everything crystallized. It was in Guatemala where the comfortable medical student would finally die, and Che Guevara would be born. The birth of a revolutionary. When Ernesto arrived in Guatemala City in December 1953, the country was in the midst of a remarkable experiment. President Jacobo Arbenz had been democratically elected and was implementing land reforms. He was redistributing unused land from wealthy corporations, including the American-owned United Fruit Company, to landless peasants. For the first time, Ernesto saw a government trying to help its poorest citizens. He was electrified by the possibility. He met with politicians, attended rallies, and volunteered in rural clinics. He watched democracy trying to heal centuries of inequality. But powerful forces opposed Arbenz. The United Fruit Company lobbied the U.S. government. The CIA, claiming Arbenz was a communist threat, began planning a coup. In June 1954, a CIA-backed invasion force entered Guatemala. Ernesto volunteered to fight. He received medical training and was prepared to defend the government. But Arbenz, trying to avoid bloodshed, refused to distribute weapons to civilian volunteers. The military abandoned him. On June 27, 1954, Arbenz resigned. A military dictatorship took power, immediately reversing all the land reforms. Ernesto was devastated. He had watched democracy be destroyed by foreign intervention. He had seen a president try to help his people and be overthrown for it. The lesson was stark and brutal. The United States would not allow progressive governments to exist in its sphere of influence. Change would not come through elections or reform. It would only come through armed revolution. Ernesto sought asylum in the Argentine embassy, then left for Mexico City. He was now 26 years old, unemployed, essentially stateless, and radicalized. In Mexico, Ernesto lived in poverty, taking photographs of tourists to survive. But he was also studying, reading Lenin, Marx, and Mao Zedong with new understanding. What had once been abstract theory now explained everything he had witnessed. It was during this time that he met Hilda Gadea, a Peruvian economist and revolutionary. She introduced him to other exiled Latin American radicals. Hilda would become his first wife, though Ernesto later admitted he married her more for political partnership than love. Then, in July 1955, Ernesto met the man who would change his life forever, Fidel Castro. Castro was a Cuban lawyer who had tried to overthrow the dictator Fulgencio Batista in 1953. The attempt failed, and Castro was imprisoned, then exiled to Mexico. Now he was building a new revolutionary movement, recruiting men for an invasion force to return to Cuba. Fidel and Ernesto talked all night at their first meeting. They discussed Marx, imperialism, Latin America, and revolution. By dawn, Ernesto had volunteered to join Castro's expedition as the group's doctor. It was Fidel who started calling him Che, an Argentine expression meaning hey or buddy that Ernesto used constantly. The nickname stuck. From that point forward, Ernesto Guevara would be known to the world simply as Che. Che trained with Castro's guerrilla force in Mexico. He learned to shoot, to navigate jungles, to survive on minimal food and water. His asthma attacks continued, sometimes leaving him gasping and unable to move, but he pushed through every time. On November 25, 1956, 82 men crowded onto a small yacht called the Granma. Their destination, Cuba. Their mission, overthrow Batista's dictatorship. Their chances, almost zero. The voyage was a disaster. The boat was designed for 25 people, but carried 82. Men were seasick constantly. The journey that should have taken 5 days took 7. When they finally landed on Cuba's eastern coast on December 2nd, they were 2 days late, landing in daylight instead of darkness, and in the wrong location. Batista's forces were waiting. Within days of landing, most of the revolutionaries were dead or captured. Only about 20 men escaped into the Sierra Maestra Mountains. They had virtually no weapons, no food, and no local support. Most observers declared the revolution finished before it started. But Che Guevara had found his purpose. In the mountains of Cuba, living on minimal rations, constantly hunted, his asthma flaring in the humidity, Che felt more alive than he ever had in comfortable Argentina. He later wrote, "I finally understood what I was born to do. Everything in my life had led to this moment." The guerrilla war would last 2 years. It would transform Che from a doctor to a commander. It would make him both a hero and a killer. And it would set him on a path from which there would be no return. The guerrilla fighter. The early days in the Sierra Maestra were brutal. The rebels were starving, diseased, and demoralized. Many wanted to give up, But Fidel Castro had an unbreakable will, and Che Guevara quickly proved he had the same quality. Che carried 2 bags, one with medicines, one with ammunition. In the first weeks, when the group was ambushed, Che faced a choice: grab the medicine bag or the ammunition bag. He chose the ammunition bag. In that moment, the doctor became a warrior. Che was ruthless in ways that shocked even other revolutionaries. When guerrillas deserted or betrayed the group, Che often personally executed them. He believed discipline was essential for survival. He once wrote, "A revolutionary must become a cold, killing machine motivated by pure hate." These words would later haunt his legacy. But Che believed he was fighting a war for human liberation, and that war demanded hardness. He saw himself as a surgeon cutting out a cancer. The work was brutal, but necessary. As the guerrilla campaign continued, Che proved himself in battle. He was fearless, charging into gunfire, leading from the front. His asthma should have disqualified him from combat, but he simply refused to acknowledge its limitations. He became one of Fidel's most trusted commanders. But Che wasn't just a fighter. He established schools in liberated villages, teaching peasants to read. He created health clinics. He organized fair distribution of food and supplies. He showed that the revolution offered something better than what Batista provided. Slowly, the guerrilla force grew. Peasants who had been exploited by rich landowners joined the revolution. Students from Havana sneaked into the mountains to fight. The initial 20 survivors became 200, then 2,000. Che commanded a column of guerrillas with absolute authority. He was harder on his men than any other commander, but he was also hardest on himself. He took the smallest rations, the most dangerous positions, the longest marches. His men respected him because he never asked them to do anything he wouldn't do himself. One of his soldiers, Joel Iglesias, recalled, "Che had this way of looking at you. If you complained about being tired or hungry, he would just stare at you, and you would remember that he had asthma, that he was suffering more than anyone, and you would shut up and keep marching." In December 1958, Che led the decisive Battle of Santa Clara. His column of just 300 men attacked a city defended by 3,000 government soldiers. Using makeshift armored vehicles and incredible audacity, Che captured the city. When a government armored train arrived with reinforcements and weapons, Che's forces derailed it and captured everything inside. The fall of Santa Clara broke Batista's will to fight. On January 1, 1959, the dictator fled Cuba. The revolutionaries had won. Che Guevara, who had arrived as a foreign doctor, was now one of the most powerful men in Cuba. Fidel Castro's forces entered Havana on January 8, 1959, to massive celebrations. Che was 30 years old. His face, bearded and intense, appeared on magazine covers worldwide. The impossible had happened. A small group of guerrillas had defeated a well-armed dictatorship backed by the United States. Power and ideology. Victory brought new challenges. Che had proven himself brilliant at guerrilla warfare, but could he help govern a country? Castro thought so. He appointed Che to several critical positions: commander of the La Cabaña fortress, president of the National Bank, and later Minister of Industries. At La Cabaña, Che oversaw the revolutionary tribunals that tried officials from Batista's regime. Hundreds were executed, some after trials that lasted mere minutes. Che personally approved many death sentences. When international critics condemned these executions, Che was unapologetic. "We executed many people by firing squad without knowing if they were fully guilty. At times, the revolution cannot stop to conduct much investigation." These executions remain the most controversial aspect of Che's legacy. His supporters argue that Batista's regime had murdered thousands and that revolutionary justice was necessary. His critics call it cold-blooded murder. The truth, as always, is complex. Che believed he was eliminating enemies who would otherwise sabotage the revolution, but his willingness to kill based on suspicion rather than certainty revealed something troubling about his ideology. The individual mattered less than the collective goal. As president of the National Bank, Che signed Cuban currency with just Che, a joke at first, but one that symbolized his contempt for money and capitalism. He worked to nationalize foreign-owned businesses, particularly American companies. This put him on a collision course with the United States. The U.S. government, which had supported Batista, was alarmed by Cuba's revolution. When Castro's government confiscated American property and began implementing socialist policies, the U.S. imposed economic sanctions. The tension escalated rapidly. In April 1961, CIA-trained Cuban exiles invaded at the Bay of Pigs, attempting to overthrow Castro. The invasion failed spectacularly within 3 days. Che wasn't at the battle. He was leading troops elsewhere, but he helped organize Cuba's defense. The failed invasion unified Cuba against American imperialism and pushed Castro closer to the Soviet Union. As Minister of Industries, Che tried to rapidly industrialize Cuba and diversify its economy beyond sugar. He worked 18-hour days, personally visiting factories, cutting sugarcane alongside workers, and living modestly despite his power. He refused a salary beyond basic needs. He lived in a simple apartment. He wanted to embody the new man, his vision of a person motivated by collective welfare rather than personal gain. But Che's economic policies largely failed. His idealism clashed with economic realities. Factories he built operated inefficiently. His rejection of material incentives reduced productivity. Cuba remained dependent on sugar exports and Soviet subsidies. Che understood revolution and warfare far better than he understood economics. During these years, Che also became an international spokesman for Cuba's revolution. He traveled the world, speaking at the United Nations, visiting communist countries, meeting with revolutionaries from Africa and Asia. His speeches were passionate and uncompromising. At the UN in December 1964, Che declared, "We must carry the war as far as the enemy carries it, to his home, to his centers of entertainment, to make it total war. It is necessary to prevent him from having a moment of peace." These words electrified revolutionaries worldwide and horrified Western governments. Che wasn't just defending Cuba's revolution, he was calling for global uprising. His fame grew enormously. His image, the iconic photograph by Alberto Corda showing Che and a beret staring into the distance, became one of the most reproduced images in history. Young people in Paris, Mexico City, and Berkeley wore shirts with Che's face. He became a symbol of youthful rebellion against injustice. But Che himself grew restless in Cuba. By 1965, he had spent nearly 6 years in government. He was successful in some ways. Cuba's literacy rate soared, healthcare improved, and the revolution survived American hostility. But Che was a warrior, not an administrator. He had conquered Cuba. Now he wanted to liberate the world. He believed Latin America, Africa, and Asia were ready for revolution. He believed that small guerrilla forces could defeat any dictatorship if they had popular support and revolutionary consciousness. He wanted to create 2, 3, many Vietnams, multiple revolutionary wars that would overwhelm imperialism. Castro tried to convince him to stay in Cuba. Che was too valuable, too important to risk. But Che couldn't be contained. He had a vision of global revolution, and he was determined to pursue it, even if it killed him. In April 1965, Che disappeared from public view. Rumors swirled. Had he been killed? Had he fallen out with Castro? The truth was that Che had left Cuba on a secret mission. He was going to Africa to support revolutionary movements. He was going to become a guerrilla fighter again. Che Guevara, one of the most powerful men in Cuba, voluntarily gave up everything, his position, his comfort, his safety, to return to the jungle and fight. It was the most idealistic and perhaps the most foolish decision of his life. The African failure. In April 1965, Che arrived in the Congo with over 100 Cuban fighters. He had come to support a rebellion against the Congolese government, led by Laurent Désiré Kabila. Che believed Africa was ripe for revolution, that colonialism had created conditions similar to Cuba's. But from the beginning, everything went wrong. The Congolese rebels Che came to help were disorganized, undisciplined, and often more interested in looting than fighting. Kabila, the supposed leader, rarely appeared at the front lines, preferring to stay in luxury hotels in Tanzania. The rebels practiced dawa, a ritual they believed made them immune to bullets. When this failed and men died, they blamed Che and the Cubans for bringing bad magic. Che was appalled. He had expected disciplined revolutionaries fighting for liberation. Instead, he found what he considered superstitious, unmotivated fighters. His diary from the Congo period is filled with frustration and disillusionment. The Cuban fighters suffered terribly. They contracted malaria, dysentery, and tropical diseases. They were attacked not just by government forces, but by local tribes suspicious of foreign fighters. Communication with Havana was difficult. Supplies were scarce. Che himself became seriously ill with malaria and dysentery, losing dramatic amounts of weight. His asthma worsened in the jungle humidity, but he refused to leave while his men remained. He wrote in his diary, "The situation here is critical, but a revolutionary cannot abandon his post simply because things are difficult." By November 1965, it was clear the Congo mission had failed completely. Castro sent word urging Che to withdraw before he was killed. Reluctantly, Che ordered the retreat. On November 21, 1965, Che and the remaining Cuban fighters left the Congo, sailing across Lake Tanganyika in the middle of the night. Che was devastated. He had failed. The revolution he imagined spreading across Africa had collapsed. He wrote, "This is the story of a failure. I have nothing to say in my defense. The situation was catastrophic from the beginning." Che spent months in Tanzania and Prague, hidden from the world, trying to decide what to do next. He couldn't return to Cuba. He had publicly resigned all his positions before leaving. He had written Fidel a farewell letter that Castro had read to the Cuban people. In that letter, Che had renounced his Cuban citizenship, saying he would fight for revolution wherever he was needed most. Che had painted himself into a corner. He had committed to a life of permanent revolution. He couldn't return to comfort without betraying everything he claimed to believe. Even though the Congo had failed, even though his body was breaking down, even though he had a wife and children he barely knew, Che felt compelled to try again. He decided on Bolivia. Located in the heart of South America, Bolivia could theoretically become a revolutionary base for liberating the entire continent. The country had a history of peasant uprisings, a large indigenous population, and a repressive government. In Che's mind, it was perfect. Castro and other Cuban leaders urged caution. The Congo failure should have taught him that theory and reality don't always align. But Che was determined. He believed his mistake in the Congo was choosing the wrong place, not the wrong strategy. In November 1966, Che arrived in Bolivia in disguise, using a false Uruguayan passport. He had shaved his iconic beard, cut his hair, and worn glasses. The face that had appeared on millions of posters worldwide was now unrecognizable. He established a guerrilla base in the remote Nyangawazu region in southeastern Bolivia. He recruited about 50 fighters, Cubans who had come with him and Bolivian communists. They began training, preparing for the long guerrilla campaign that would, Che believed, spread revolution across South America. But once again, almost everything went wrong, and this time there would be no escape. The final campaign. The Bolivian campaign was doomed from the start, though Che refused to see it. His plan depended on peasant support, but the Bolivian peasants were deeply suspicious of outsiders. Many were indigenous Quechua and Aymara speakers who didn't speak Spanish well. Che and most of his fighters couldn't speak indigenous languages. The cultural disconnect was enormous. The Bolivian Communist Party, which Che had expected to support him, refused to help. They thought Che's approach was reckless and would destroy their own political work. Local communist leader Mario Monge met with Che and demanded overall leadership of the operation. When Che refused, he withdrew his support entirely. Che was essentially on his own, leading a small force in hostile territory with no local backing. The Bolivian government, tipped off by deserters and peasant informants, quickly located Che's base. In March 1967, just months after arriving, Che's guerrillas fought their first battle. They won the fight, but lost something crucial: secrecy. Now the entire Bolivian military was hunting them. Che's health deteriorated rapidly. His asthma medication ran out. In the humid valleys of Bolivia, he suffered constant attacks that left him unable to walk or even speak. His fighters had to carry him. His diary entries show a man struggling with physical collapse. "My lungs are failing. Without medication, I am helpless. But we continue." The guerrilla columns split, planning to reunite later, but they never found each other again. Communication was impossible in the dense terrain. One group was ambushed and destroyed. Che's group wandered the jungle, lost, starving, and increasingly desperate. They had no support network. Peasants, rather than helping them, reported their movements to the military. The Bolivians were offering rewards for information. Unlike in Cuba, where the guerrillas had become heroes to the poor, in Bolivia, they were seen as foreign invaders. The CIA, determined not to allow another Cuba, sent advisors to Bolivia to help hunt Che down. They trained Bolivian rangers in counterinsurgency tactics. They provided intelligence and equipment. The net was closing. By October 1967, Che's column had been reduced to just 17 exhausted men. They were barely surviving, moving from village to village, always hunted, never safe. Che knew the end was near. His diary entries became shorter, more resigned. On October 8, 1967, Che's group entered a narrow ravine near the village of La Higuera. It was a tactical mistake. The ravine made escape nearly impossible. Bolivian rangers, acting on a tip, surrounded them. A firefight erupted. Che's rifle was shot out of his hands. He was hit in the leg. Disabled and captured, Che surrendered, saying, "Don't shoot. I am Che Guevara, and I am worth more to you alive than dead." The Bolivian soldiers couldn't believe they had captured the famous Che Guevara. They took him to a small schoolhouse in La Higuera. Che was wounded, exhausted, and barely able to breathe without his asthma medication, but his eyes still burned with defiance. The Bolivian government faced a dilemma. If they put Che on trial, he would use it as a platform to spread his message. If they imprisoned him, he might escape or be rescued. The CIA advised execution. On October 9, 1967, Bolivian President René Barrientos gave the order: Che Guevara must be killed, but it must look like he died in battle. A Bolivian sergeant named Mario Terán was chosen for the execution. He entered the schoolhouse where Che sat on the floor, his hands bound. Terán was nervous, hesitating. According to witnesses, Che looked up at him and said, "I know you've come to kill me. Shoot, coward. You are only going to kill a man." Terán fired. The bullets hit Che in the chest and throat, but deliberately avoided his head and heart. The wounds needed to look like they came from a battle. Che Guevara died at approximately 1:10 p.m. on October 9, 1967. He was 39 years old. His body was displayed to journalists and military officials, proof that the legendary revolutionary was dead. Photos show Che's corpse laid out on a concrete slab, his eyes open, looking almost peaceful. In those photos, he resembled images of Christ, a comparison that would later fuel his mythic status. The Bolivian military cut off Che's hands to preserve his fingerprints as evidence. They buried his body in a secret location, hoping to prevent his grave from becoming a shrine. For nearly 30 years, the location of Che's remains was unknown.
Then, in 1997, a team of forensic anthropologists found a mass grave near Valle Grande, Bolivia. Among the bodies, the identified Che's skeleton, positively identified by dental records and the fact that the hands were missing. Che's remains were returned to Cuba, where they were interred in a massive mausoleum in Santa Clara, the city he had liberated during the Cuban Revolution. Fidel Castro attended the ceremony, so did thousands of Cubans. The revolutionary's journey had finally ended. The complicated legacy. Che Guevara's death didn't end his story, it transformed it. In death, he became larger than life, his image reproduced on millions of t-shirts, posters, and murals worldwide. But who was the real Che, and what does his life teach us? Che's legacy is deeply divided. To some, he's a hero who dedicated his life to fighting oppression and inequality. To others, he's a violent ideologue responsible for executions and failed policies that cause suffering. Both views contain truth. Che genuinely believed in human dignity and equality. He saw suffering and dedicated his life to ending it. He gave up comfort, wealth, and safety, things most people desperately pursue, to fight for others. He could have lived as a doctor, married, raised children, and died comfortably. Instead, he chose hardship and sacrifice. His famous statement captures this idealism. At the risk of seeming ridiculous, let me say that the true revolutionary is guided by great feelings of love. It is impossible to think of a genuine revolutionary lacking this quality. Che believed revolutionary violence was justified because it aimed to end the greater violence of oppression, poverty, and exploitation. He saw himself fighting systems that killed far more people through starvation and preventable disease than guerrillas ever could. But Che's methods were undeniably brutal. He executed people, some of whom may have been innocent. He advocated hatred as a revolutionary tool. He showed little concern for individual rights when they conflicted with revolutionary goals. His economic policies in Cuba, though well-intentioned, often failed and caused hardship. And ultimately, Che's strategy didn't work. The Bolivian peasants he came to liberate saw him as a foreign intruder. His guerrilla movements in the Congo and Bolivia collapsed. The global revolution he envisioned never materialized. By most practical measures, Che's revolutionary project failed. Yet Che's symbolic power persists. Why? Perhaps because he represents something universal, the desire to fight injustice, to refuse comfort when others suffer, to believe that individuals can change history. Young people wear Che's image often without knowing his full story. They respond to what he represents: rebellion against authority, commitment to ideals, courage to act on beliefs. In this sense, Che is less a political figure than an archetype, the eternal revolutionary.
But there's danger in mythologizing Che without understanding him. His life shows both the power and the peril of absolute commitment to ideology. He achieved remarkable things, but also caused harm. He liberated Cuba from one dictatorship, but helped create another. He fought for the poor, but his methods sometimes hurt them. The lesson isn't simple. Che's life doesn't give us easy answers about whether violent revolution is justified, whether individual rights matter less than collective welfare, or whether idealism justifies brutality. Instead, Che's story challenges us with difficult questions. How do we fight injustice without becoming unjust ourselves? How do we balance idealism with reality? When does commitment to a cause become destructive fanaticism? How do we know if the price of revolution is worth paying? Che never doubted his answers. He believed completely in his mission until the moment he died. That certainty gave him courage, but also made him inflexible. It made him inspiring, but also dangerous. Perhaps the real lesson of Che's life is this: passion and conviction can change the world, but wisdom requires understanding that we might be wrong, that our methods might cause unintended harm, that victory isn't always what we imagine it to be. Che once wrote, "If you tremble with indignation at every injustice, then you are a comrade of mine." This remains his most powerful legacy, not the violence, not the failed guerrilla campaigns, but the idea that we should care deeply about suffering and be willing to act to end it. Conclusion: the revolutionary's paradox. Che Guevara lived just 39 years, but he packed multiple lifetimes into those years. He was a doctor who became a killer, an Argentine who became Cuban, an idealist who committed brutal acts, a success who chose failure, a man who could have had everything but chose to have nothing. His journey began with curiosity about suffering and ended with his own violent death. Along the way, he helped overthrow a dictatorship, administered a government, became an icon, and died in a Bolivian ravine far from everything he loved. What should we take from his story? First, that caring about injustice matters. Che saw suffering and couldn't look away. He could have lived a comfortable life treating wealthy patients in Buenos Aires. Instead, he spent his life trying to help people who had nothing. Whatever we think of his methods, his motivation to reduce suffering was noble. Second, that intentions don't excuse consequences. Che believed he was fighting for liberation, but his actions sometimes caused oppression. His executions took lives. His economic policies failed. His guerrilla campaigns caused death without achieving liberation. Good intentions don't automatically create good outcomes. Third, that ideology can both inspire and blind us. Che's commitment to revolutionary socialism gave him courage to fight powerful enemies, but it also made him rigid, unable to see when his theories didn't match reality, unwilling to question whether violence was truly necessary. Fourth, that sacrifice and courage are powerful, but not sufficient. Che was willing to die for his beliefs, and that courage moves us, but courage without wisdom can lead to tragedy. Che's willingness to sacrifice himself was admirable. His willingness to sacrifice others was problematic. Finally, that history is complicated. We want heroes and villains, but Che was neither and both. He was a human being, flawed, idealistic, brave, brutal, caring, and cold. He did remarkable things and terrible things, often believing both were necessary. Che's final words, "Shoot, coward, you are only going to kill a man," capture his essence. He faced death fearlessly because he believed his ideas would outlive him. And in some way, they have. The image of Che inspires millions, even if they don't fully understand what he believed or did. The question Che's life poses to each of us is personal. What are you willing to sacrifice for what you believe? What injustice moves you to action? How will you balance idealism with reality, passion with wisdom, conviction with compassion? Che answered those questions one way. His answer led to both liberation and death, both inspiration and tragedy. Your answer will be different. It should be different, because ultimately, Che's story isn't a blueprint to follow. It's a mirror that forces us to ask who we are and what we stand for. Che once said, "I don't care if I fall as long as someone else picks up my gun and keeps on shooting." But perhaps the real question is, should we pick up the gun or should we find another way? Should we repeat Che's choices or learn from his mistakes? Should we admire his courage while rejecting his methods? These are questions only you can answer. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the life of Che Guevara, a man who changed history, who embodied both the hope and the danger of revolution, whose image remains powerful decades after his death. His story doesn't give us easy answers, but it challenges us to think deeply about justice, about sacrifice, about how we change the world and what price we're willing to pay.
If you feel inspired, challenged, or troubled by Che's story, share it with others. Discuss it. Debate it. That's what Che would have wanted. Not blind worship, but engagement with the difficult questions his life raises. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more powerful stories that will challenge your thinking and improve your English. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and remember, history isn't just about the past. It's about understanding who we are and who we choose to become.